rate your life right now on a scale of 1 to 10. Got your number. Okay, so here is the massive catch. You are strictly forbidden from choosing the number 7.
Oh, wow.
Right.
Oh.
If that symbol rule makes you suddenly, really uncomfortable, you aren't alone. So, okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to explore how the specific language we use shapes our psychological patterns, of failure, of stagnation, and ultimately our recovery.
Yeah, exactly.
And we are pulling this framework from literally the absolute last place you would expect to find some profound life philosophy. We're looking at an English learning curriculum.
An English learning curriculum.
Yeah, specifically, It's a dialogue designed to teach students vocabulary for setting goals and assessing their progress for the year 2026.
It sounds incredibly mundane on the surface, doesn't it? I mean, just a functional language lesson designed to help people pass a test or, I guess, speak a bit more fluently in a corporate meeting.
That's exactly what I thought at first, to be honest. But this curriculum, it's like a Trojan horse.
Right.
You think you are just looking at a straightforward vocabulary list, but hidden inside is this entirely brilliant psychological blueprint for overhauling your life. It acts as a mirror, really.
Yeah, it does.
We're going to look at the exact vocabulary of our own slumps so we can shortcut our way to a personal comeback.
It is a fascinating framing device because it relies on a very specific psychological mechanism, which is naming our emotional space.
Right.
The core premise hidden within this curriculum is that human beings get stuck because we lack the precise language to define how we are stuck.
Yeah.
Giving these abstract, kind of messy emotional states precise vocabulary is the very first required step to changing them. I mean, if you cannot articulate the exact nature of your failure, you are basically just flailing in the dark.
And the curriculum doesn't just hand you a flashlight. It basically forces you out of the dark by making you play a game.
Yeah, the game.
That is where that 1 to 10 scale comes in. They call it the no 7 game. You rate your year or your progress on a specific goal, but 7 is entirely off the table. So why is 7 so dangerous that it has to be banned from the exercise entirely?
Because, well, 7 is the ultimate social armor. Think about the psychology of a 7. It is the numerical equivalent of saying, I'm fine, don't ask me more.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Exactly.
Cool.
It's polite. It doesn't trigger any alarm bells for anyone. And most importantly, it doesn't invite any follow-up questions from your friends, your family, or even from yourself.
Right. It's a shield.
It provides plausible deniability. I mean, you aren't claiming to be a 10, which would require proof, but you aren't a 4, which would require an intervention.
It's the perfect hiding spot. It really reminds me of hitting the snooze button on your own life.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Because when the alarm goes off, hitting snooze feels incredibly good in the immediate moment because it protects you from the harsh reality of actually waking up.
Right.
But it's a completely false comfort. You are guaranteeing that you are going to wake up 20 minutes later feeling rushed, anxious, and totally unfulfilled.
That is a perfect parallel. What's fascinating here is that the curriculum points out that when you strip away the armor of the 7, you create immediate cognitive friction.
Cognitive friction?
Yes, people can no longer rely on their autopilot response. So they are often forced to look honestly at their situation, and, more often than not, they rate themselves a 5.
A 5?
Yeah, and the text defines this feeling of being stuck at a 5 with a very specific heavy word. It calls it being complacent.
Complacent, which they describe as starting the year with these massive overarching dreams, but eventually just getting comfortable.
Right.
Like you aren't thrilled with your life, but crucially, you aren't sad enough to actually do anything about it. You are just waiting around for external circumstances to change.
Exactly. Complacency implies an absence of both satisfaction and urgency. You are just sort of hovering in this stagnant, purgatory-like middle ground where no active choices are being made at all.
But let me push back on this for a second. Because we live in a culture that is constantly warning us about burnout, right? So if someone rates themselves a 5, is that inherently a sign of toxic complacency?
Right.
Shouldn't we have periods of neutral existence? I look at a 5 and think, maybe that is just a necessary resting state before the next big sprint. Like, why does the text frame a 5 as such a negative baseline?
It is a very natural defense mechanism to want to reframe a 5 as rest. I mean, we want to believe we're just catching our breath.
Right.
But if we dig into the mechanics of human behavior, there is a clear biological and psychological distinction between resting and what the text calls complacency.
Okay, what's the difference?
Rest is an intentional, highly active state of recovery. You are purposefully stepping back to rebuild your capacity.
Okay, yeah.
Complacency, on the other hand, is a passive state of surrender. If you are a 5 in this framework, you are not intentionally gearing up for a sprint. You've surrendered your agency. Removing the 7 forces you to admit that you aren't resting. You're just hoping a solution will magically appear without your input.
Wow. Okay. That distinction between intentional recovery and passive surrender is huge.
Yeah.
So once we strip away the 7 and we are forced to look completely nakedly at our 5, we have to figure out the mechanics of how we actually got there. Like, how do we fail?
Right.
Because the source material reveals something deeply counterintuitive. It shows that our failure is almost never a sudden, dramatic explosion. It isn't some catastrophic event. It is a quiet, agonizingly slow fade.
The anatomy of failure is laid out with brutal clarity here, and it begins with what psychologists often refer to as the perfectionism trap.
The perfectionism trap.
Yeah. We set out in January with these grand goals for 2026. We want to execute them flawlessly. We want to study a new language every single day or work out every morning at 5 a.m.
Right, the perfect routine.
Exactly. And when we inevitably are not perfect, when we fall short of our goals by only doing the habit twice a week instead of 7 times, our internal reaction is incredibly disproportionate to the actual mistake.
The word the curriculum uses to describe that reaction is devastated. Like, we feel this immense shock. We miss one single workout, and we are emotionally devastated.
Yes.
So what does this all mean? I have a real question about the causality here. When we look at someone abandoning their goals, is it the actual failure, like the mathematical reality of missing the workout, that derails them?
No, it's not the math.
Or is it the devastation, our dramatic emotional reaction to not being perfect, that actually causes the damage?
That is the critical pivot point in this entire blueprint.
Yeah.
It is absolutely the emotional reaction that derails us. I mean, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the mathematical reality of working out twice a week is still a net positive for your health.
Right, twice is better than 0.
Exactly. But unmet perfectionism leads to internal shock. Your carefully constructed identity as a, perfectly disciplined person is threatened.
Right.
That cognitive dissonance is deeply uncomfortable. And to protect yourself from feeling that devastation again, your brain simply shuts down the effort. You fall into apathy.
And that apathy leads directly to the concept of drifting. The metaphor the text uses for drifting is haunting. They describe it as being in a boat with no motor, just moving slowly into the completely wrong place.
It perfectly captures the lack of conscious choice. When the motor cuts out because of that emotional devastation, you don't just stay in one place. The current takes you.
Right. You don't wake up on a Tuesday and consciously declare, I choose to fail today. I choose to abandon my 2026 dream.
No, nobody does that.
You just drift. You skip one lesson because you're tired, then you skip a workout because you're busy, then you order takeout for 4 days straight.
Yeah.
You are making no active choices, and the current of your old life just pulls you downstream until you eventually crash into the shore. You hit rock bottom.
And this brings us to one of the most fascinating psychological reframes in the entire curriculum. We culturally treat rock bottom as a death sentence, right? Like the ultimate tragic endpoint.
Yeah, obviously.
But the text frames rock bottom as a highly advantageous place to be.
Which sounds completely backward. How is the absolute lowest point of your life an advantageous starting line?
Because of the elimination of ambiguity. Think about the cognitive load of being a 5. When you are hovering at a 5, your brain is constantly running background negotiations.
Like, should I do this or that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Should I change jobs?
Yeah.
Should I end this relationship? Am I okay or am I miserable?
Yeah.
That constant negotiation consumes a massive amount of mental energy. Decision fatigue sets in.
Oh, sure.
But when you hit rock bottom, that ambiguity vanishes. You are undeniably a 1. The internal debate is over. You have 0 mental energy tied up in pretending things are okay, which means that freed up energy can now be channeled entirely into upward movement.
Wow.
Rock bottom generates the necessary friction that complacency destroys.
The comfort is gone, so the action becomes mandatory.
Exactly.
Okay, so now that we are at the bottom and the ambiguity is gone, we need the exact blueprint to get out. The source outlines the execution of what it calls the 2026 comeback. And let me tell you, they do not sugarcoat this.
No, they don't.
It is distinctly unglamorous. It explicitly says you have to claw your way back. It likens the process to climbing a mountain with your bare hands.
Yeah.
There is no cinematic montage with upbeat music. It is taking it one small, painful step at a time.
Which is such a necessary corrective to the modern self-help industry, I think.
Yeah.
Using words like clawing strips away the illusion of the quick fix, the 30-day challenge, or the overnight transformation.
Right.
Clawing implies desperation, grit, and a distinct lack of elegance.
Sure.
It sets the correct expectation for the journey.
But the curriculum doesn't just leave you hanging there with bleeding fingernails on the side of the mountain. It gives a crucial, highly tactical strategy to stay strong during this climb. You have to anticipate the bad days.
Yes.
The specific example they give is so practical. If you know for a fact that you are always exhausted on a Tuesday, you do not act surprised when Tuesday arrives.
Right.
You don't rely on sudden motivation to push through. You prepare for it by planning a microscopic, ridiculously easy 5-minute habit specifically designed for that exhausted Tuesday.
This is where we see the transition from abstract goals to systemic design. You are pre-solving for your own inevitable human frailty.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. Because this concept of anticipating the bad days is basically like setting out your gym clothes the night before, but applied entirely to your mental energy.
Oh, I love that comparison.
We all know that if the clothes are physically sitting right next to the bed, your 6 a.m. brain doesn't have to make a choice. You remove the friction. The text is applying that exact same logic to your prefrontal cortex.
Exactly.
If your Tuesday plan is just 5 minutes of effortless review, you entirely remove willpower from the equation. Willpower is a finite resource. It gets depleted throughout the day. If you have to actively negotiate with your exhausted self every single Tuesday evening, you will eventually lose.
That is a phenomenal analogy.
Yeah.
You're essentially bypassing the decision-making centers of the brain when they are at their weakest.
Right.
And this raises an important question about how society views optimism versus preparation. We are constantly told to stay positive, to visualize success, and to manifest good outcomes.
Oh yeah, good vibes only.
Right, but this text suggests that purely visualizing success leaves you incredibly vulnerable. Anticipating failure, knowing you will be tired, knowing your willpower will be depleted on Tuesday, is not pessimism. It's a concept called strategic buffering.
Strategic buffering. Man, I love that term.
It protects your comeback from the inevitable reality of fluctuating energy levels. Toxic positivity demands you be at a 10 every day. Strategic buffering acknowledges that on a Tuesday, you might naturally be at 2, and it builds a system that prevents that 2 from turning into a 0.
You are basically building shock absorbers for your own life. But even with the best shock absorbers, even with a rock-solid, willpower-free plan for exhausted Tuesdays, the framework acknowledges that our own minds are still going to try to sabotage us. The final step of the comeback isn't just about executing the habit. It is about framing your narrative and breaking the deeply ingrained pattern of how you perceive yourself.
Because perception is where the battle for long-term change is truly won or lost. You can have the best systems in the world, but if your internal narrative doesn't shift, the systems will eventually collapse.
The source notes that fear has this terrible, almost magical power to obscure our progress. It hides what we've actually accomplished. We get so completely fixated on the 2 days we fell short that the fear completely obscures the 20 days we succeeded. We forget that we are actually measurably better than we were last year.
Yeah, we totally lose sight of it.
The text says that to rise from the ashes of our old life like a phoenix, we have to break out of a pattern. We have to stop this repeating cycle of excuses and self-sabotage.
And this is where the behavioral science beautifully intersects with the emotional language. A pattern is just a feedback loop.
But the method the curriculum suggests for breaking this pattern, I have to push back hard on this.
Okay, let's hear it.
They say the key to breaking the pattern is to do one single thing differently today. Just one. We are talking about rising from the ashes here. We are talking about overhauling a life where you drifted all the way to rock bottom.
Right.
Does doing just one microscopic thing differently today actually possess enough power to break a deeply ingrained life pattern? Or is that just a drop in the bucket that makes us feel good for a second before we inevitably slide backward into the current? It feels like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon.
It absolutely feels like a drop in the bucket if you are only looking at the immediate physical result of the action. But if you understand the psychology of momentum, it makes perfect sense.
Okay, how so?
A pattern, like we said, a feedback loop, is maintained by identical choices, constantly reinforcing an identical identity. I'm a person who always gives up. When you do one thing differently, even something incredibly small, like doing that 5-minute Tuesday habit, you introduce a glitch into the system.
A glitch.
You disrupt the identity. You are no longer the person who always gives up. You are now a person who sometimes tries.
The glitch in the system, that's powerful.
Exactly. That single difference begins to chip away at the obscuring fear. It generates proof of concept. Your brain says, wait, we did the habit today. Maybe we aren't a failure. It creates a tiny spark of certainty.
Right.
But the text is smart. It doesn't stop with just the physical action. It paired that action with a powerful cognitive reframing exercise to lock the new identity into place.
The movie title exercise. This is such a fascinating, creative way to close out their curriculum.
It really is.
They challenge the student to frame their recent life struggles as a movie. The example given in the text is someone summarizing the grueling, exhausting past 2 months of their life by naming it the slow climb.
I want to direct this right to you listening to us right now. Think about the last few months of your life. What stands out to you when you try to name your current movie title?
Yeah.
Because what this exercise does is brilliant. It forces psychological distancing.
How does that distancing actually work in practice, like mechanically?
Well, when you are inside the struggle, when you are at rock bottom or clawing your way up,
Right.
your amygdala is firing. It feels like chaotic, overwhelming pain. You are the protagonist trapped in the mess.
Right.
But when you are forced to give it a movie title, you instantly step out of the protagonist's shoes and become the director. You become the observer of your own life.
Wow.
A title like The Slow Climb acknowledges that the reality is hard, but it implies an upward trajectory. It implies a narrative arc where the protagonist, you, is eventually going to succeed.
Framing our struggles narratively gives us the emotional distance needed to overcome the fear that obscures our growth. It turns a messy, exhausting reality into a highly meaningful story. The slow climb.
Yeah.
You aren't just suffering aimlessly. You're currently in the gritty second act of a triumphant movie. It completely changes the context of the pain.
It reframes everything.
Let's look back at the incredible journey this deep dive has taken us on today, all pulled from an English vocabulary lesson. We started by ditching the safe, cowardly protection of the number 7. We looked honestly at the 5 and defined the quiet, paralyzing danger of complacency.
We then mapped out the exact mechanics of how we fail. It's not an explosion. It's the quiet devastation of perfectionism that causes us to cut the engine and drift uncontrollably into rock bottom. But we learned that rock bottom is actually the birthplace of clarity.
From that clarity, we learned how to claw our way back up, not with blind toxic optimism, but by strategically buffering our lives. Anticipating our tired Tuesdays and building microscopic habits that don't rely on willpower. And finally, we learned to break the cycle by introducing a glitch into our identity, doing one small thing differently, and claiming our own movie title to give our struggle a narrative purpose. You now possess the exact vocabulary to diagnose your slumps and architect your own comeback.
The language we use truly builds the reality we inhabit. Having the precise terminology for these complex states transforms them from invisible emotional weights into solvable mechanical problems.
Which brings us to a final lingering question for you to mull over as you go about the rest of your day.
All right.
We've talked about this framework mostly in terms of personal habits or 2026 learning goals. But if the fundamental rule of this entire game is that you cannot choose a 7, and you refuse to settle for the complacent purgatory of a 5 Corone, what happens if you apply this forced join metric to the rest of your life?
Ooh, yeah.
If you boldly removed the safe, fine, don't ask me option from your career trajectory, from your closest relationships, or from your daily routines, what uncomfortable truth would you be forced to confront about your life right now?